Hello everyone. We are going to study The Last Duchess by Robert Browning. We will Hello everyone. We'll study the form, meter, rhyme scheme, literary and historical context of My Last Duchess by Robert Browning. The form of the poem My Last Duchess is a dramatic monologue. This form was particularly prevalent during the Victorian period, that is from 1837 to 1901. Now, this form enabled Browning in this poem to explore the inner working of the mind of a narcissistic, power obsessed tyrant, the Duke, from the past, much as a novelist might. The speakers of dramatic monologues are often biased and decidedly unreliable, presenting only partial or warped perspectives on events. This certainly seems to be the case with the Duke. He repeatedly explains that his former wife, the last Duchess, was unfaithful and deserved the punishment which he gave him. A careful examination of the poem also reveals that she was only guilty of being kind to others and smiling too much. Yet, because only the Duke is talking, he controls the narrative. The poem doesn't have clear breaks or stanzas. It consists of one long stream of couplets, 28 in all. The lack of distinct stanzas subtly reflects the Duke's clear love of hearing his own voice and his refusal to listen to others. He talks too much, and that there isn't room or space for a stanza break. The poem contains both open couplets, that is rhymed and jammed lines, as well as closed or heroic couplets, that is rhymed and stopped lines. Heroic couplets were very popular in England in the 18th century, and because of their regularity, they were considered an ideal form for literature of high seriousness, such as translations of ancient Greek epics. Open couplets, because of the lack of punctuation at the end of a line, are more flexible and subtly de-emphasize their final rhymes. Now, Browning's poem uses both types of couplets, but the couplets are more often open than closed. Here we see that Browning is suggesting that the Duke is not as heroic as he imagines himself to be, and that is the Duke's cruelty. Like the poem's rhymes are hiding in plain sight and waiting for something to notice the disturbing pattern. Now, the meter of the poem, The Last Duchess. Browning's My Last Duchess is written in iambic pentameter throughout, although some lines make that easier to detect than others. The poem's final line is one of the simplest to find out, since the entire line is one complete phrase and with proper names to show the stresses. Iambic pentameter tends to mimic or copy the sound of regular speech, meaning its use here makes the poem sound more conversational, like when the Duke is just chatting with a friend rather than artfully choosing his words. Of course, this is likely that Duke's intent to seem like he's speaking off the cuff, when in reality he is following a strict script that allows him to dominate and manipulate his listeners. The meter of the poem too seems conversational, but it follows a strict pattern. The poem does break from this pattern at times, though, as the first two lines demonstrate. That's my last Duchess, painted on the wall, looking as if she were alive. I call. The word looking is a trochee, and by putting it at the beginning of the second line of the poem, Browning subtly destabilizes the meter of the opening. At this moment, this irregularity makes the poem sound much more conversational. These metrical substitutions are like brief interruptions to keep it from becoming too carefully controlled. So the rhyme scheme of the poem My Last Duchess, is written in rhyming couplets. The rhymes are all perfect rhymes and the scheme of the poem is consistent throughout. It follows the pattern AA, BB, CC, DD, and so forth right until the end of the poem. The rhyme scheme is subtly de-emphasized, however, by the poem's lack of end-stopped lines because all the lines are enjambed, freely flowing from one to the next without definitive ends. The rhymes seem nearly hidden when read out loud. The ends of sentences don't always align with the end of the actual lines of the poetry, and this gives the poem a more conversational quality. And the opening lines of the poems demonstrate this. That's my last Duchess painted on the wall, looking as if she were alive. I call the piece a wonder now, Fra Pendol's hands. Wall and call rhyme, but because the sentence with call is enjambed, the rhyme almost disappears. The line swiftly goes on to the next line in order to complete its sentence. Now the speaker of my last Duchess, that is the Duke of Ferrara, who is addressing the emissary of a count before dowry negotiations for the count's daughter. Although the speaker claims to merely want to show the emissary of his prospective bride around his estate and to show off the artwork, he actually, that is the Duke, actually wants to complain about the unsuitability of his first wife. He also brags about his power and wealth and to manipulate the emissary and the count into giving him a higher dowry for his daughter, that is, for the daughter of the count. And since this is a dramatic monologue, everything is told from the speaker's perspective. The readers never hear the emissary speak, nor learn how the Duke's words are received. Throughout the poem, the speaker unintentionally reveals himself to be a tyrant and an expert manipulator, and also a murderer. Now, the setting of My Last Duchess is Duke of Ferrara's estate in the 16th century Italy. Although the poem does not include many detailed descriptions of the estate itself, it does describe the Duke's extensive art collection, including the painting of the Duke's former wife, the Duchess, and also a statue of god Neptune taming a seahorse. Both these works of art are produced by famous, though fictional artists in this poem, making them markers of the Duke's wealth. It is safe to think that this estate is large and impressive, given the Duke's emphasis on the social status. The poem takes place in front of a large painting of Duke's wife, who is presumably now dead. The painting has not been placed haphazardly in the estate either. It has curtains around it and also a seat in front of it. This argument allows the Duke to manipulate his guests into listening to him. The literary context of My Duchess. Robert Browning, along with Alfred Tennyson and Augustus Webster, was one of the great Victorian innovators of the dramatic monologue. Such monologues often reveal deep and troubling insight into their speakers, typically without said speaker even realizing it. This is certainly the case with the Duke in this poem, who complains about his wife. Instead, his own deep character flaws and shortcomings. Browns repeatedly turned to the form to explore the psychology of his characters, whether they were psychopaths and or artists. In Andrea del Sarto, My Last Duchess was first published in Dramatic Lyrics in 1842, which was the first of Browning's several volumes of dramatic monologues. Like several of his dramatic monologues and longer narrative poems, Browning set My Last Duchess in Renaissance Italy, and although his speaker, the Duke of Ferrara, is not an artist himself, as the speakers of other poems are, he is a patron of arts. Although it did not become famous when it was originally published, but the poem is now regularly printed in anthologies and upheld as a prime example of dramatic monologue. The poem has reappeared in a number of contemporary literary works. The historical context of the poem. Now, Browning wrote this poem during the Victorian era, which encompassed the second half of the 19th century, during the reign of Queen Victoria in England. Victorians were very fascinated with the Italian Renaissance, including its poetic forms, music, architecture, and culture. And the Renaissance, which extended from 14th to the early 17th century, placed an emphasis on humanism, individualism, the arts and science, all of which particularly appealed to a Victorian society that was making scientific and artistic advances of its own. The Renaissance also was a time when some elite and wealthy families served as patrons of artists, supporting their favorite artistic endeavors. In a way, the poem critiques such patrons as perhaps being more concerned with the social clout confirmed by being associated with certain artists that they were with the actual artwork itself. In other words, it suggests that some patrons of art just wanted to seem cool and influential by supporting artists, but they really didn't actually appreciate their art. This poem focuses on real historical patron of the arts, the Duke of Ferrara, also known as Alfonso d'Este. The Duke of Ferrara was an actual historical figure who lived in Italy in the late 1500s. Like the speaker, Alfonso II had multiple wives, the first of which died very young and after only a few years of marriage. Okay, thank you.